The small town of Adams, Tennessee, had long since settled into a quiet existence. Years had passed, and yet the story of the Bell Witch Mansion lingered in the collective memory like a ghostly presence. Tourists would come and go, some leaving in quiet amusement, while others swore they felt the eyes of something unseen on the back of their necks. Yet, no one had dared stay for long. No one, except for Daniel Mercer. Daniel was not a believer in ghosts or curses. He considered himself a man of logic, a professor of history at a small university with an insatiable curiosity for legends. When he first heard the tale of the Bell Witch, it struck him as just another local myth, an exaggeration passed down through generations. But as he researched further, the details became more intriguing, and his curiosity grew into an obsession. Against the warnings of friends and colleagues, Daniel decided to rent the infamous Bell Witch Mansion for a month to write his book and perhaps unravel the truth behind the legend. The house stood at the end of a dirt road, its decrepit walls and sagging roof a testament to the years of neglect. There were no welcoming lights, only the soft glow of the moon casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. The trees seemed to close in, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the house. Daniel stood before the mansion with his bags at his feet, feeling a strange unease creeping up his spine. He shook it off as nothing more than nerves and walked up the crumbling steps, keys jangling in his hand. Inside, the mansion was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that felt deliberate. Dust coated the floor, and cobwebs hung in the corners like forgotten memories. Daniel explored the rooms, finding them empty save for old, decrepit furniture that seemed to have been left untouched for decades. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. Yet, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. It was just a house, a neglected, old house. That first night, Daniel set up his workstation in the study, a large room with an imposing fireplace and walls lined with dusty, empty bookshelves. He lit a fire, trying to chase away the chill that clung to the room, and settled in to begin his notes. Hours passed in silence, interrupted only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the floorboards. As the night wore on, Daniel felt the weight of sleep beginning to pull at him. He closed his laptop, stretched, and decided to call it a night. It wasn't until he lay in bed, in the small guest room at the back of the house, that he first heard it, a soft, whispering sound. He bolted upright, straining to listen, but the sound was gone. His heartbeat quickened. Maybe it was just the wind, he told himself. The house was old, the walls thin. But no matter how hard he tried to rationalize it, sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, there was again faint whispers, just beyond the edge of his hearing. They seemed to be coming from somewhere deep within the house, growing louder and more persistent with each passing minute. Unable to ignore it any longer, Daniel got out of bed and followed the sound. It led him down the narrow hallway, past the empty rooms, until he reached the cellar door. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like voices calling his name, pulling him closer. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, but he hesitated. Something inside him screamed to turn back, to leave this place. But his curiosity, his need to understand, overpowered his fear. He opened the door. The cellar was dark, the smell of damp earth and decay filling his nostrils. As he descended the creaking wooden steps, the whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by an overwhelming silence. He stood at the bottom, his breath coming in shallow gasps, the flashlight in his hand casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. But there was nothing, no movement, no voices, just the quiet. Suddenly, the door slammed shut above him. Daniel rushed up the stairs, his heart pounding, but the door wouldn't budge. He banged on it, shouting, but there was no response. Then, from behind him, came a soft, chilling voice whispering his name. Daniel. The voice, soft, distant, and unmistakably real, curdled Daniel's blood. He froze mid-step, his breath catching in his throat as the flashlight trembled in his grip. He whipped around, shining the light across the cellar, but it illuminated nothing more than the old stone walls, thick with mold and grime. The voice was gone as quickly as it had come, leaving only silence and the oppressive weight of the dark surrounding him. Forcing himself to breathe, Daniel cursed under his breath. "It's just your imagination," he told himself. "The stories got under your skin." He had spent too much time reading about the Bell Witch, about the strange occurrences that had plagued the Bell family centuries ago. He couldn't allow himself to believe the same madness had come for him. But when he tried the door again, it wouldn't move. He shoved his shoulder against it, using all his weight, but it was as though something on the other side held it shut. Panic started to creep in as he continued to push and slam his fists against the heavy wood. "Hey! Let me out!" Daniel yelled, his voice echoing in the confined space. But only silence answered him. Just as the fear began to take root, there came a faint sound from behind, a scuttling, like tiny feet scraping across the stone floor. Daniel stiffened, his flashlight sweeping over the cellar again. And then he saw it, a dark shape in the far corner, small but unmistakably there. He squinted, trying to make sense of it, his mind racing through logical explanations. A rat, maybe? Or something worse? The thought chilled him, and he kept his distance. But then, it moved. The shape rose from the floor, too large, too fluid to be a rodent. His heart stopped as the black mass expanded, like smoke gathering in the air, forming into something almost humanoid. His rational mind screamed that it couldn't be real, that this was some trick of the shadows, but the shape stood tall, lingering at the edges of the beam of light. And then it whispered again. "Daniel." His heart pounded in his chest. This time, the voice was closer, louder. He staggered back, nearly tripping over the steps as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. He wasn't a man prone to fear. He had always prided himself on his calm, logical approach to life. But this was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The figure stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. It had no face, just a mass of darkness, shifting like mist, but its presence was palpable, filling the small cellar with a suffocating pressure. Daniel's breath came in short, shallow bursts. His eyes darted to the door, his mind frantically searching for an escape. What do you want?" Daniel stammered, though he wasn't sure why he expected an answer. The figure did not reply. Instead, it began to glide towards him, slow and deliberate, as if savoring his fear. The flashlight flickered in his hand, the beam of light growing weaker, sputtering as though it, too, was afraid of what lurked in the shadows. In an instant, Daniel's paralysis broke. He lunged up the stairs, pounding his fists against the door, screaming for help. His voice echoed in the darkness, the cellar walls swallowing his cries. No one would hear him out here, not in the middle of nowhere, not in this cursed place. Behind him, the sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, grew louder. The shadow figure was closing in. Desperation took over, and Daniel began kicking at the door, throwing his entire body into each blow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the door flew open with a loud crack. Daniel scrambled through, slamming the door behind him with a force that rattled the old wood. For a moment, everything was still. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing, and his mind whirled, trying to piece together what had just happened. He was safe. He was out. But when he looked down at his hands, they were trembling uncontrollably, and cold sweat clung to his skin. He stumbled back into the hallway, the house now ominously quiet. The air had changed, thick with something heavy and malevolent. The atmosphere felt charged, as though the entire mansion was watching him, waiting. Without thinking, Daniel grabbed his jacket from the study and bolted for the front door. Every instinct told him to leave, to get as far from this place as possible. But just as he reached for the doorknob, the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began to creep up the windows, and the lights flickered before going out entirely. Then, from behind him, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, dragging footsteps coming down the hallway. He turned slowly, his breath fogging in the air. There, at the far end of the hallway, stood the same shadowy figure, now closer, clearer. It hovered there, unmoving, its form still shrouded in darkness, but it seemed more real now, more solid. And though it had no eyes, Daniel could feel it staring into him, as though it could see every fear he'd ever harbored. The air around him vibrated with tension, and the whisper returned, only now it was louder, almost a growl. "Daniel, you're mine." Daniel's heartbeat echoed in his ears as he stood frozen, staring at the dark figure that loomed at the end of the hallway. His hands instinctively reached for the door behind him, but his fingers trembled too much to grip the handle. Cold sweat slid down his spine, his breath coming in shallow gasps. For a fleeting moment, he thought about making a run for it, but something about the figure, the way it stood so still, so silent, held him in place. The shadow figure didn't move. It simply waited, as though it knew there was no need to hurry. Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on his chest, making it harder to breathe. Every instinct screamed at him to flee, but his body refused to obey. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, casting a dim, flickering glow throughout the hallway. The shadowy figure was gone. Daniel spun around, his heart still racing, but the hallway behind him was empty. No shadow. No sound. It was as though the darkness had simply swallowed it whole. He wiped the sweat from his brow and forced himself to think clearly. He couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was haunting this place was no myth. It was real, and it had marked him. He had to leave. Now. But as Daniel reached for the front door again, a sharp pain shot through his chest. It felt like an icy hand had wrapped around his heart and was squeezing it tight. He gasped, clutching at his chest, his vision blurring as the cold seemed to seep into his bones. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling his ears like a chorus of voices speaking in unison. "Don't leave, Daniel." The door refused to open, as though welded shut. Panic surged through him, and he slammed his shoulder into it, but it wouldn't budge. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now, his breath coming in short, ragged bursts. Behind him, the sound of dragging footsteps started again, slowly creeping closer. Daniel spun around, backing himself against the door as his eyes darted across the dim hallway. His mind raced, grasping at anything that might make sense of what was happening. He was a historian, a man grounded in facts and logic. Yet nothing about this was logical. He had read the stories about the Bell Witch, but those were tales from centuries ago. How could this be happening now, to him? The air in the room shifted, growing colder with every breath he took. And then, he saw it, an imprint on the floor, like a shadow stretching across the old wooden boards. It was back. The figure slowly reappeared, emerging from the darkness like smoke rising from a fire, its form growing clearer with each passing second. This time, there was no mistaking it. The figure was human in shape but utterly wrong, its limbs distorted and elongated, moving with a slow, unnatural grace. Daniel's throat tightened with terror as the figure floated toward him, its presence suffocating, consuming all the light around it. His legs refused to move. He was trapped, pinned against the door as the figure grew closer, and the temperature in the hallway plummeted. Just as the shadow reached out for him, Daniel's body reacted. With a surge of adrenaline, he broke free from his paralysis and dashed down the hallway. His feet pounded against the floorboards as he ran blindly through the house, twisting and turning through the maze of rooms. Every corner he rounded felt more claustrophobic than the last, the walls closing in on him as the house itself seemed to shift around him. He reached the staircase and bounded up 2 steps at a time, his breath ragged in his throat. Behind him, the figure's footsteps echoed, slow and deliberate, as if it knew he couldn't escape. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around his thoughts like a tightening noose, filling his mind with fear and doubt. Daniel burst into one of the upstairs rooms, slamming the door shut behind him. His chest heaved as he leaned against the door, sweat pouring down his face. The room was dark, save for the dim light filtering in through the cracked window. Dust filled the air, and the furniture was draped in old white sheets, long abandoned. For a moment, there was silence. The footsteps had stopped. He listened, every muscle in his body tense, but there was nothing. No sound. No movement. He exhaled slowly, his hands trembling. Maybe he had outrun it. Maybe. The door shook violently behind him, the wood splintering as though something massive had slammed into it. Daniel stumbled back, his heart leaping into his throat. The door shuddered again, a deep, guttural sound rumbling from the other side, like a growl from some ancient beast. He backed away, his eyes darting around the room for an escape, but there was none. The window was too small, and he was too high up to jump. He was trapped. With a deafening crash, the door flew open, and the figure stood in the doorway, its form towering over him. This time, it was more than just a shadow. It was solid, its limbs twisted and unnatural, its face an empty void of darkness. It filled the room with its presence, blotting out the light, suffocating Daniel with its sheer weight. Daniel, it whispered, its voice like gravel scraping against stone. You can't run. Daniel's legs gave out beneath him, and he fell to the floor, his body trembling uncontrollably. The figure stepped closer, its cold presence pressing down on him like an unbearable weight. He tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The last thing he saw before the darkness consumed him was the figure's twisted hand reaching for his face, pulling him into the void. When Daniel came to, he was lying on the cold floor, his body stiff and sore. Every muscle screamed in protest as he tried to push himself up, but a sharp pain shot through his chest, forcing him back down. His vision was blurry, and the air felt thick and oppressive, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. It took a moment for him to realize he was no longer in the upstairs room. The space around him was different, darker, colder. The air smelled damp, like old earth and rotting wood. He blinked hard, trying to focus, but the shadows seemed to swirl around him, moving of their own accord. It was as if the house had shifted, trapping him in some forgotten part of itself. A faint light flickered in the distance, barely illuminating the narrow corridor he now found himself in. The walls were rough and uneven, made of old stone that looked as though it had been here for centuries. It didn't feel like the rest of the mansion. It felt like something older, something buried deep beneath the earth. His heart pounded in his chest as he forced himself to stand, wincing against the pain. How had he gotten here? The last thing he remembered was that horrible figure, its hand reaching for him, then nothing. Now he was in this place, a place that shouldn't exist. He needed to find a way out before whatever had brought him here returned. Daniel staggered forward, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the narrow passage. The light flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. Every step he took seemed to amplify the silence, the oppressive stillness that clung to him like a second skin. He felt as if the mansion was watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The whispers returned, this time softer, almost like distant murmurs. They swirled around him, tugging at his mind, pulling him deeper into the darkness. Daniel tried to shake them off, but they wormed their way into his thoughts, twisting his sense of reality. "Come closer," the voices whispered, seductive and insidious. "We've been waiting for you." He clenched his fists, trying to ignore the pull, but it was relentless. His mind felt clouded, like a fog had settled over his thoughts. The urge to keep moving forward, deeper into the bowels of the house, was overwhelming, almost as if something was guiding him. The passageway narrowed, and the walls seemed to close in around him, making it hard to breathe. Daniel pressed forward, his heart racing, his eyes darting to every shadow that seemed to move at the edges of his vision. His hands brushed against the cold, rough stone, and he shuddered at the chill that seeped into his bones. Then, up ahead, he saw it, a door. Old, rotting wood, its surface carved with strange symbols he didn't recognize. The door stood out, stark against the dark stone, as though it didn't belong here. It called to him, pulling him closer. Daniel hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering over the rough surface. Every fiber of his being screamed at him not to open it, to turn back and find another way out. But there was no other way. This was the only path forward. With a deep breath, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was enormous, far larger than any room in the mansion should have been. It was a cavernous space, the ceiling disappearing into darkness above him. The walls were lined with flickering candles, their flames casting eerie shadows that danced and writhed as though they were alive. The floor was made of cold stone, slick with moisture. At the center of the room stood an altar, made of rough-hewn rock, covered in strange, ancient symbols. As Daniel stepped into the room, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. He spun around, but the door had vanished, leaving only a solid stone wall. Panic surged through him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was trapped. Suddenly, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with their insistent murmur. The air grew colder, and Daniel's breath came out in visible puffs of fog. The temperature in the room dropped rapidly, and his skin prickled with the intense chill. He could feel the presence of something old, something malevolent, watching him from the shadows. Then, from the darkness, the figure emerged again. But this time, it wasn't a shadowy wraith. It was real, solid. Its twisted form was cloaked in darkness, its face hidden behind a veil of blackness that seemed to shift and writhe like smoke. It moved slowly, deliberately, gliding across the stone floor toward the altar. Daniel backed away, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped in the room with this thing, whatever it was. He could feel its gaze on him, though it had no eyes, and the weight of its presence was almost unbearable. The figure raised one long, twisted arm, pointing at him. Its voice, when it spoke, was a deep, guttural growl that reverberated through the room. "You cannot escape the curse," it said. "The Bell Witch has claimed you." Daniel shook his head, stumbling backward. "No, this isn't real," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the roar of blood in his ears. "This can't be happening." The figure took another step forward, its presence suffocating, and Daniel could feel his strength draining away. His legs felt weak, his vision blurred. The room seemed to tilt, the shadows closing in on him from all sides. "You will suffer as they did," the figure hissed. "As they all have." Daniel's back hit the wall, and he slid to the ground, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He could feel the cold creeping into his bones, numbing him, freezing him from the inside out. The figure loomed over him, its twisted hand reaching down, closer and closer. In a final, desperate act, Daniel reached out and grabbed a candle from the wall, hurling it at the figure. The flame flickered through the air, but instead of extinguishing, it burst into a brilliant blaze the moment it made contact with the figure. The creature recoiled, a horrible screech filling the room as the flames consumed it. Daniel scrambled to his feet, seizing his chance. He bolted toward the altar, frantically searching for any sign of an escape. The shadows around the room writhed and twisted, but as the flames spread, the darkness seemed to retreat. The figure screamed again, its form disintegrating into ash as the fire engulfed it. Daniel's heart raced as he watched the flames consume the altar, the ancient symbols glowing brightly before crumbling into dust. Suddenly, the stone wall behind the altar cracked, revealing a narrow passage leading out into the darkness. Without a second thought, Daniel ran, his feet pounding against the stone as he plunged into the unknown, leaving the burning room and the cursed mansion behind. Daniel stumbled through the narrow passage, his lungs burning with each desperate breath. The oppressive air of the mansion still clung to him, thick and suffocating. Every sound echoed off the cold stone walls, amplifying his frantic footsteps. But more than the weight of the air, it was the crushing realization that he wasn't alone. The passageway twisted and turned, but the darkness never seemed to relent. Shadows flickered at the edges of his vision, moving as if alive, watching him. He could feel it, the presence from the room, the spirit of the Bell Witch, still following him. He didn't dare look back, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, and a cold chill ran down his spine. It was coming. The mansion felt alive, as if it were shifting around him, its ancient walls narrowing, squeezing tighter as he ran. Every twist in the path seemed to grow more confusing, more disorienting. It was as if the house itself was manipulating his escape, guiding him deeper into its cursed heart. The sound of distant whispers began to swell once again, growing louder with every step. "Don't look back," Daniel whispered to himself, forcing his legs to keep moving despite the burning in his muscles. But the temptation was too strong, the weight of the presence behind him too overwhelming. He turned his head for just a moment, and there it was. The figure, no longer a mere shadow, but a looming specter of darkness, glided through the passage behind him. Its long, bony hands reached out, fingers curling as if to grasp him. Its face, if it could be called that, was a swirling void, a mass of dark energy that radiated pure malevolence. The Bell Witch had returned, and this time, it wasn't content with haunting him. It was hunting him. With a guttural scream, Daniel pushed himself harder, darting through the narrow corridor as fast as his legs could carry him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening, but nothing felt real anymore. It was as though the boundaries of time and space had fractured, leaving him in this twisted, nightmarish version of the mansion. Ahead, he saw a flicker of light, just for a moment, an open door. A way out. His heart leaped with hope, but the whispers swelled louder, nearly deafening him now. The walls around him seemed to pulse, growing narrower and narrower, until he had to twist his body sideways just to squeeze through. The sound of the specter's rasping breath filled the tunnel, closer now. It was gaining on him. Daniel's hand reached out for the doorframe, his fingers brushing against the cold wood. With a final burst of energy, he hurled himself through the opening and into a massive, dimly lit chamber. The stone floor was uneven, and he stumbled as he hit the ground hard, rolling to a stop at the center of the room. He gasped for breath, every muscle in his body trembling from exhaustion and fear. But as he looked up, his heart sank. This wasn't an escape. It was a trap. The room was circular, with towering walls of smooth stone and no other exits in sight. In the middle stood an ancient stone well, its mouth wide open and black as the void. From its depths, a cold, eerie wind emanated, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of whispering voices, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all overlapping, all calling out to him. And then he saw the symbols. Carved into the stone walls, the same ancient runes he'd seen on the altar, glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. They pulsed with an energy that made his skin crawl, as if the very walls were alive, watching him, waiting. The door he had come through slammed shut with a thunderous crash, and Daniel spun around, eyes wide with terror. The Bell Witch was here, in the room with him. Its presence pressed down on him like a physical weight, suffocating him. The specter hovered just inside the door, its form larger, more defined, as if it was feeding off the fear that saturated the air. The swirling mass of darkness that was its face twisted and writhed, the void growing darker, more malevolent. Its fingers stretched out toward him, impossibly long, as if to wrap around his throat and squeeze the life from him. Daniel backed up, his legs shaking, but there was nowhere to run. The well loomed behind him, its gaping mouth drawing him closer with every step. The whispers were louder now, almost overwhelming, filling his head with a cacophony of voices, each one promising pain, suffering, and death. The Bell Witch moved closer, slow, deliberate. Daniel's breath came in shallow gasps, his back pressed against the cold stone of the well. He could feel the darkness reaching out from within it, pulling at him, beckoning him to fall into its abyss. No, this isn't real, Daniel muttered to himself, his voice trembling. It's just a dream, it has to be. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. This was real. The curse was real, and it was coming for him. With no other options, Daniel made a desperate decision. He grabbed one of the loose stones from the edge of the well and hurled it at the specter. The stone passed through the Bell Witch harmlessly, its form rippling like smoke, but for a brief moment, the figure paused, as if startled. It was now or never. Daniel turned and sprinted to the opposite side of the room, frantically searching the walls for some kind of hidden passage, a trapdoor, anything that could save him. His hands scraped against the cold stone, but there was nothing. The whispers were all around him now, filling the room, filling his mind. He could feel the presence closing in, the Bell Witch's cold breath on his neck. Just as the figure was about to strike, the wall in front of him shifted. There, barely visible, was a small, concealed door. Without thinking, Daniel pushed it open and flung himself through. He tumbled into a narrow tunnel, the stone floor cold and slick beneath him. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the tight space. For a moment, there was silence. No whispers, no shadows, just the sound of his own ragged breathing. Daniel lay there for what felt like an eternity, too terrified to move. His entire body trembled with exhaustion and fear, but he knew he couldn't stop. Not yet. The mansion wasn't done with him, and somewhere, deep in the dark, the Bell Witch was still watching. Daniel's legs burned as he stumbled through the dark hallways of the mansion, the flickering light of his phone his only guide. His heart was pounding, but it wasn't just the chase that unsettled him now, it was the realization that, in all this time, the Bell Witch hadn't attacked him directly. She was toying with him. Every sound, every breath she took was deliberate, like a cat playing with a mouse. But why? He collapsed in the corner of what must have once been a study. Dusty bookshelves towered over him, the faint smell of decayed paper filling the air. He gasped for breath, his mind swirling with memories, his childhood, his father's disappointed face, the way he always felt like a failure. Was that it? The witch, feeding off his fears, his regrets? Every inch of this place, every haunted whisper, wasn't just about the curse, it was personal. She was inside his head. Suddenly, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He wasn't just being haunted by the Bell Witch, she was making him confront himself. His failures. His fears. Every unresolved piece of guilt and shame. The witch had chosen him because he was weak, broken, and she thrived on that. With shaking hands, Daniel reached for his backpack. Inside was the journal he found in the basement, covered in dust but still intact. He hadn't opened it until now. His fingers grazed the cracked leather cover as he flipped to the final pages, hoping for answers. The ink was smeared, but the message was clear. The witch feeds on what you hide. It is not the house that is cursed, it is you. We are all damned by our own secrets. As Daniel read those words, his heart sank. There was no escape, no running, no hiding. The curse wasn't something he could just outrun. It lived inside him, inside his darkest thoughts. A chill filled the room, and he felt it, the witch's presence growing stronger. Her voice, a low whisper, echoed in his ears. Daniel, you can't hide from yourself. He dropped the journal, his pulse racing as he stood. His eyes darted around the room, looking for any sign of movement, any shadow lurking in the corners. Then, from the shadows, she emerged, no longer just a whisper or a fleeting presence. The Bell Witch, in all her ghastly form, stood before him. Her eyes, hollow and cold, seemed to pierce through his very soul. And then, she smiled. Daniel's body froze as the Bell Witch slowly advanced toward him. His mind screamed for him to move, to run, but he was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by an overwhelming sense of dread and inevitability. She spoke, but her voice wasn't a whisper now. It was clear, sharp, and filled with a twisted amusement. All these years, you've run from what haunts you. But there's no running from yourself, Daniel. Her words sliced through him, deeper than any physical wound. He realized then, he had come here for a reason. Not just to confront the legends, not just to explore the supernatural. No, deep down, he came to face the one thing he could never escape, himself. His regrets, his failures, the pain he had tried to bury. The witch's voice softened, as though mocking him. You think this is about me? About this house? No, Daniel. This is about you. You are your own tormentor. You've always been. Suddenly, memories came flooding back, his father's disappointment, his own sense of failure in life, the guilt that had gnawed at him for years. Every wrong decision, every missed opportunity. He had been carrying this weight for so long, it had poisoned him. The Bell Witch didn't need to attack him. She had simply given him what he feared most, the truth. Do you want to see it? She hissed, her face just inches from his. The moment it all fell apart, without warning, the room around him twisted, the walls warping as if reality itself was bending to her will. Daniel found himself no longer in the mansion, but in a memory, a moment from his childhood. He was standing in his old house, watching his younger self as a boy, sitting at the dining room table, his father standing over him, shouting, "You'll never amount to anything, Daniel. You're a failure. A coward." The younger Daniel sat there, eyes wide and filled with shame. That was the moment the moment he had been running from all these years. The seed of doubt and guilt that had grown into the man he was today. And now, the Bell Witch had dragged him back to it, forcing him to confront the source of his pain. Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes as he realized what she was doing. She wasn't just tormenting him physically, she was breaking him mentally, emotionally, stripping away every defense until there was nothing left but the raw, aching truth. "Please, stop," Daniel whispered, his voice cracking. The witch's grin widened. "You stop yourself, Daniel. Or die with it." For the first time, Daniel truly understood. This wasn't about the house or the legend. The curse of the Bell Witch was a reflection of the people who came here, broken souls, like him, who couldn't face their own demons. And now, he had a choice. The walls of the memory began to crumble, and Daniel felt himself being pulled back into the mansion. The witch's laughter echoed around him as everything collapsed. But something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a spark of defiance, a refusal to let this place, this entity, destroy him. He stood tall, staring directly into the witch's cold, hollow eyes. "I am not afraid anymore," he whispered. And with that, the witch's form began to fade, her power weakening. The mansion around him seemed to dissolve, and for a moment, Daniel thought he might be free. But then, just as quickly as she had begun to disappear, the witch returned, her eyes burning with fury. "You think you can walk away from this?" she snarled. "You don't escape. No one ever does." Daniel braced himself for the worst, but this time, there was no fear. He had faced his past, his guilt, and he knew now that it wasn't the witch that held him captive, it was his own mind. And in that moment of clarity, the mansion fell silent. The Bell Witch was gone. Daniel stood alone in the empty room, the weight of everything he had faced crashing down on him. He had survived, but he knew the truth. The real curse wasn't the witch, it was the ghosts we carry inside us. As he left the mansion, the night air felt different, lighter. The world hadn't changed, but Daniel had. For the first time in his life, he felt like he could breathe. But as he walked away from the mansion, a cold wind brushed past him, carrying a faint whisper on the breeze. "You never truly leave."